Welcome. I'm Tim Moore. I serve as the Deputy Director at the Center for the Study of the American Constitution. We're joined today by John Kaminsky, the Director of the Center, and he also is the Editor-in-Chief of the documentary History of the American Ratification of the American Constitution. Welcome, John. And I think our next 35, 40 minutes, maybe, I guess for the lack of a better title, is the issue of slavery in the early republic. Might be an accurate way to describe and frame our set of questions. I'd like to start out with the first federal Congress. In your estimation, is it kind of surprising that some of the very first petitions that came to Congress were about slavery, given that the Constitution seemingly indicates that it's kind of an off-limits topic? So your thoughts on those petitions that came into the first Congress regarding slavery?
There were two issues involved in these petitions, and the petitions came in from the Quakers, their general meeting, and also the abolition societies in Philadelphia and New York City. And one of these, I believe, was the Philadelphia petition that calls for emancipation of slaves. The other three called for the elimination of the foreign slave trade, that is the trade bringing Africans to America eventually and being sold into slavery. The Constitution mentions the one but not the other. The Constitution does not mention slavery. Never is the word slavery included. And never does it say that slaves, the institution of slavery, is protected. It does say that 3/5 of other persons will be represented in the House of Representatives. And that is a certain reference to the institution of slavery, but it doesn't say slavery per se. There's nothing in the Constitution that protects slavery. And that becomes an issue, to be sure. There is the provision in the Constitution about the African slave trade that Congress cannot ban the foreign slave trade until 1808. That doesn't mean the slave trade doesn't stop. And in fact, at that particular time, 12 of the 13 states had stopped the foreign slave trade, had prohibited it. Only Georgia had it open at that time. South Carolina will open it up a little later on, but they pass some laws at different times prohibiting the African slave trade for 3 years. And then they open it up briefly and then close it again. But that has no constitutional consequence. It's Congress that is prohibited from banning the foreign slave trade until 1808. The states can do whatever they want to do. So what these petitions propose to do is to change that constitutional limitation on the African slave trade, but to interpret the Constitution in broad language that will allow the emancipation of slavery to take place. This is one of the things that Patrick Henry feared, that the necessary proper clause, the general welfare clause, the war powers provision of the Constitution will allow the Congress to emancipate the slaves. So that was Patrick Henry's fear, and others also felt that same fear. So this is what the Pennsylvania Abolition Society would like to operate on, that implied power that would allow Congress to emancipate the slaves. And so these petitions come in and they argue first on the basis of the African slave trade that it cannot be prohibited until 1808 by Congress. And the other side is they denounce the broad perspective of the Constitution that would allow for the emancipation of slaves. Neither one of these requests by the abolitionist societies get very far. They denounce, the Southerners denounce them both. The Northerners agree that these are not actions that Congress can take. They cannot interfere with the condition of slaves in their home states. This is a state issue, but it does report both in a select committee and then committee of the whole, and they report that the states should ameliorate the conditions of slaves there, and Congress should be able to control the foreign slave trade, not to eliminate it, but to control it, to decide how many slaves are carried on a ship. Some of the terrible, cruel conditions had been recently exposed at that time. And so there was sort of a hue and cry that, okay, if we can't stop the trade, let's at least make it more, less cruel, less inhumane. Well, that doesn't get very far either. And Congress does, in essence, nothing but to publish the reports of the committee, the select committee, and the committee of the whole. And it shows that Congress says it has no authority to either emancipate the slaves or to stop the slave trade before 1808. It recommends that states take some kind of action to better the condition of their slaves. But Congress itself does no action except for allowing the reports to be published, but no act is passed by Congress.
I'd like to address the issue of colonization. I mean, it comes up very early, earlier than maybe many teachers are aware of, but maybe briefly explain what colonization is. And we often look at colonization from a presentism point of view and kind of scratch our heads. But was there a reasonable, was there a reasoned argument for colonization at this time period?
I think that the word colonization is a word that Americans have an affinity for. They like colonization. We were colonized. We got started that way, the United States of America. We're talking about colonizing the universe. Let's go to other planets. And that's a good colonization here. But what they're really talking about, perhaps a better word than colonization would be deportation. That's what they were talking about, is to take African Americans, whether they be freed or slaves. They were going to be, if they were slaves, they'd be made free, they'd be emancipated. But then they would be forced to leave, to go to some other place. Question is, where would that other place be? Could it be Canada, if Canada was conquered during the Revolution? Would it be the West? Would it be the West Indies? Or would it be Africa? Africa would be the best place to go because that's where these people originated from. But it's a long distance away and it would be very expensive. Over and above the transportation side of it, there's also the issue of slaves and freed blacks that were born in America. They don't have a home in Africa. They don't have a home elsewhere. How do you do that? You're talking about 20% of the population. The population by the end of the war was about 3 million people. So you're talking about 800,000 people. How can you deport 800,000 people? And what about the difference among them? What about those people who want to go and establish a new place a colony, as opposed to those who don't want to go. Some would argue, let's do this with the children. Let's take the children away from their parents. The parents are too old to move. Where do you get the money for all of this? So it was a difficult concept to believe it could be successful. It was just too financially expensive to think about, and the pure logistics of it was difficult. Where do you do this? I mean, if you take and establish African American colonies in the west of North America, wouldn't eventually the white population surround it and you get conflicts? I mean, the whole concept of this was based upon the fact that white and black human beings could not live together peacefully, that whites would always view blacks as inferior, and blacks would always have a hatred for whites for what they had done to them. And so they could not live together in peace. They had to be separated. And if you put them in the blacks in the West, eventually they'd be surrounded by the whites. So that was not practical. But Africa was the logical place. But I would say people deceive themselves to think that such a colonization, such a deportation system could have worked.
Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about Jay's attitude about slavery, and then this seeming moral contradiction in him owning a slave.
Yes. Well, Jay was the first president of the New York Abolitionist Society in 1786. And so he was an opponent of slavery. I hesitate to use the word abolitionist because I don't think he was an active advocate in favor of emancipation. But he and his wife go to Spain in 1779 as Jay's the first minister to Spain from the United States. And on the way there, they have ship problems. First, they strike a iceberg in the middle of the North Atlantic. And I'm not sure, but I think icebergs can sink ships. So that was a real danger for them. But then they got a hurricane and they were demasted. Several of their masts were severed in the storm. And so the captain of the ship went to Jay and said, "You're the one that has to make a decision. Do we go on to Spain and risk being captured by the British as we get closer to Europe? Do we go back to America? Or do we go to the French West Indies and get the ship refitted there?" And Jay decided, let's go to the French West Indies. So they go to Martinique, and they're there for several weeks. Eventually, the Jays leave and on a different ship to go to Spain. But while there in Martinique, they see a slave auction taking place. And there's a young teenager there, a male teenager, and he's ready to be auctioned off. And the Jays realize that this young boy will not live but 2 more years as a slave in the West Indies. And therefore, they purchase him to save his life. And they treat him as an indentured servant. They feel they can't emancipate him. It's against the law to do such a thing, to emancipate this child who has no parents there. And so the state would be responsible for him. And so that's not possible. So Jay keeps him as a slave, treats him as an indentured servant, pays him. When he becomes an adult, when he turns 21, he asks Jay for his freedom. And Jay says to him, that he would give him his freedom. He would sell him his freedom. That is, once he paid Jay for what Jay had paid for him in the West Indies. And so it would have been nice had Jay freedom outright, but that did not happen. But you can see the dilemma that the Jays were in. They opposed slavery, but then they bought a slave. But they bought this slave to save his life, that they feared would be short-lived if he stayed in slavery.
Another person I think might be nice for you to mention is the role of Marquis de Lafayette in this issue of slavery in the early America, and his correspondence with Washington regarding that issue.
Yes. Well, Madison mentions in a letter to Jefferson Lafayette and says he has 3 hobby horses. One is the Union of the States. Second is the alliance between France and the United States. And the third is the emancipation of slaves. So that was something dear to Lafayette's heart. And so when Lafayette left the United States in 1781, after the Battle of Yorktown, he was serving sort of a lobbyist for the United States in various European theaters. But he wrote to Washington saying that he had come up with a scheme that the 2 of them should buy a plantation in the west of Virginia and to put freedmen there. And that would show 2 things. First of all, that freedmen could survive on their own economically and socially. And second of all, that Washington endorsed emancipation. That would have a profound impact in America. Washington's response was, well, let's talk about that when you come back to the United States. And the anticipated visit took place in 1784. And Lafayette visited Mount Vernon twice during that his stay here. And no recording of the discussion on slavery. And so Lafayette went back to France. And in 1786, he wrote to Washington and said he had instituted his project in the West Indies island of Cayenne. And he bought a plantation there and he stocked it with freedmen. And he hoped that it would survive. Others followed suit on this. Benjamin Rush did the same thing in northeastern Pennsylvania, but I think it was 5,000 acres of land and put freedmen there with the one stipulation that they could not sell the land to white folks. So this was an effort, a experiment to see whether this would work. Lafayette, when he was captured in the French Revolution, he was eventually captured by the Germans and Austrians. He hoped that the French government, in expropriating Lafayette's land, would allow that experiment to continue in Cayenne.
Another individual that comes up every once in a while in early American history is Benjamin Banneker and his relationship or his correspondence with Jefferson. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that relationship and what it reveals about Jefferson's attitude towards him as a freedman.
Well, Banneker was a freedman, was not born a slave, but was born of mixed marriage. He certainly was dark-skinned, and he was educated as a mathematician, an astronomer, a surveyor. He was a scientist. He was eventually chosen as one of 3 surveyors who did the surveying of the new federal capital in what became Washington, D.C. Well, he sent in that was off in the future still. But in 1791, he wrote to the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, and alluded to the Declaration of Independence, reference to all men are created equal. And he hoped that Jefferson would lead in the emancipation of slaves. He thought that Jefferson should follow through on his writings about the equality of man. And he understood that Jefferson himself personally owned slaves. And he hoped that Jefferson would do something about that, both in his personal life and in his professional political capacity. Toward the end of his letter, Banneker indicates that he was sending Jefferson, a manuscript copy of an almanac that he had written. He said, I could wait to send you the printed almanac, but I wanted to show you in my own handwriting this almanac that I had done to show you that Blacks are capable of just as high thoughts as white folks have, and that we're not inferior. So that was the justification that he had in the reason that he had in sending Jefferson the copy of the almanac. Jefferson responded, as he often did, to folks about slavery, saying that no one in the world would prefer the elimination of slavery more than I, if it could be done in the proper fashion. That caveat was always there. There had to be some conditions met, and he referred to it in that sort of general way. If the appropriate conditions were available, he would advocate such a thing. So that's the relationship between the two. And he said that he has sent to the almanac to one of his French colleagues, Condorcet, to show him about what Banneker indicated that Blacks were capable. Unfortunately, that letter that covered the almanac, Jefferson said, I think he probably did not do it himself. I think he had help from his Quaker neighbors who helped him with that. And so he didn't think that Blacks were capable of doing that kind of work. So that Jefferson, I think he's always opposed slavery per se, and would like to get rid of slavery if it could be done. It becomes difficult for him personally, economically, to do such a thing. So he really doesn't free any of his slaves to speak of during his lifetime. And he would like to see the country get rid of slavery if it could be done within certain restrictions. But as far as the equality of man, I think Jefferson veers more and more as time goes on to being a racist, to believing Blacks are inferior to whites. At first, when he starts writing about slavery, he says, I'm not sure. It could be just the condition that they're in, the fact that they're discriminated against, the fact that they're in slavery. They don't have the opportunity. He writes that to Banneker. As time goes along, he becomes more and more convinced in his own mind that Blacks are indeed inferior to whites. And it's a reason why intermarriage and miscegenation should not take place, over and above the moral side of the issue, that he would oppose that kind of sexual interaction. But there was also this other side that the mixture would produce an inferior offspring. And so that Banneker's letter is sort of in the evolutionary stages of Jefferson's thinking about slavery and the inequality of man.
I guess I'd like to conclude with maybe an overarching question. that often comes up today, and it may be the ultimate issue is presentism, but many have suggested that we not take the founders' qualms about slavery seriously, that it's just rhetorical window dressing. How would you respond to that particular issue?
I don't think it was window dressing. I think they really faced a dilemma. I think they all realized that slavery was a moral sin, if you want to use that word. It was something that should not exist. And they all realized it should be done away with. They have different reasons for that. One, just the fact as to why it won't happen. And one reason was their own personal loss. I mean, they had to replace the slaves that were there. And could they do that viably? So much of their money, their capital was involved in slaves. And so there was always the sense that there should be gradual emancipation and compensated. They should be compensated for the loss of their property. But they had to somehow come and personally to rationalize their action, knowing the action that is, or lack of action, in keeping slaves in bondage. And these excuses that they came up with helped to make them feel at peace with themselves. There was always that danger that was there, however, and they could never get above it. Each one of them had their own points of view, and I think in the book that you alluded to before, The Necessary Evil, that I did, and I should emphasize that that's a question. There's a question mark. I'm not saying it was a necessary evil. It was, in the eyes of Southerners, a necessary evil that slavery existed. In the eyes of other Americans, it was not a necessary evil. It was an evil, to be sure, and it should be done away with. But the question is, why didn't emancipation work for that generation? They surmounted tremendous difficulties in gaining their own independence, something that was illogical in many respects, unlikely to have this upstart group of disorganized colonies revolt against the most powerful country in the world. Yet they did it. They took that leap of faith and was successful in it. But they did not do the same taking of a leap of faith in getting rid of slavery. And that's partly because of their attitudes that they had. Each of them had their own personal perspective. But in my judgment, the problem that existed, why slavery was not eliminated, was because the Southern leadership did not step forward and take the lead in this regard. Men like Jefferson, Washington, and Madison. They had the opportunity, but did not seize upon it. Washington eventually freed his slaves in his will, freed his slaves after his death and Martha's death. They would all be freed and provided for in certain ways. But neither Jefferson nor Madison could go so far. And they believed that there had to be gradual emancipation, compensated emancipation, and then colonization, deportation, and then a replacement of that workforce by some other individuals that would be migrating to the United States, preferably like the Pennsylvania Germans that were there, hardworking white folks. So it was a dilemma that they faced, and they realized that it could well end in civil war. And so they took this very, very seriously. But for some reason or other, they couldn't make that major step, either personally or for the country, in emancipating slaves. It was not a decision that was easy for them, but it was the decision to keep slaves in bondage. Seemed to be them to be at that time more practical than the alternatives, the dangers of the alternatives that they faced.
Well, John, thank you. This concludes our second segment for our conference, and appreciate your time. And as always, if any of you that are watching this, uh, feel free to contact us at the Center for the Study of the American Constitution. We'd love to hear from you. So, John, thank you. And with that, we'll sign off here.